Hello everyone, welcome to GB Bricks. In today's video, with Christmas on the horizon, I'm going to look at the Winter Village sub-theme from LEGO, and I'm going to rank all 16 entries in this particular sub-theme, obviously from my least favourite up to my favourite. Now there are other sets that you could class as being in this sub-theme. I've said 16 a minute ago. I'm going from 2009 up until 2024 this year, of course, and I'm doing that because LEGO themselves on their official website do have a page dedicated to this particular sub-theme, and that's the sets that they include as part of it. There are a few others. There was a set in 2006 and a few others that you could potentially argue deserve to be here, but as I said, I'm going via LEGO's website, so 16 sets included. Which of those is my favourite? Well, let me show you. So starting off in 16th place, then we have 10245. This is Santa's Workshop, which released in 2014. Now I will reiterate that there isn't a bad set on this list, and last place on this list is almost about the halfway point on most other lists in terms of quality, but this is my least favourite of the 16 Winter Village sets. I'll start off by saying I'm never a massive fan of brick built animals, and obviously the reindeer included in this set are a large part of it, and that does detract from the overall appeal to me. And also I do feel that the interior is quite sparse. Now this isn't exclusive to this set, that is something that runs through a number of these, but the title Santa's Workshop doesn't really indicate what the set offers as far as I'm concerned. It's more of Santa's office if you look at what's inside, with the more workshop parts of it actually being side builds that don't really fit into the interior, not logistically, just in terms of the overall feel. I do like the exterior of the building, and I like the Mrs. Claus figure that you get with it, as well as the other figures. They're all nice additions, but I do feel this is the weakest of the 16 Winter Village sets. In 15th place we have 10339. This is Santa's Post Office, and this is this year's 2024's offering. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with this set. It's a strong build. I like the idea of it. It's quite whimsical. I have said in the intro that I do like the more realistic street based sets when it comes to this theme, so obviously that does play a part in my rankings, this being one of the more fantastical North Pole sets as was the previous one, but it's not even really that. I'm not a big fan of the sand blue and the medium nougat together in terms of the colour scheme, and I just feel that it's a lot of ideas that have been pushed together that make for an okay overall build, but it does feel a little disjointed for me. The hot air balloon is a nice fun idea, and it does mean that you can buy the other set that they've released this year, being the small post van, without duplicating anything you've got in this build, but it does just feel like a bit of a hodgepodge of ideas for me. I do like the slide where the letters go down with the naughty and nice sides. I think that's quite clever, and 15th place on a very strong list isn't the end of the world as far as I'm concerned. In 14th place then we have 10249, which is the Winter Toy Shop from 2015. This is the only entry so far that's a remake of a previous set from another year, and obviously its predecessor hasn't made an appearance yet, which kind of lets on to my feelings to this remake. Again, there's nothing wrong with it. It looks perfectly fine. Obviously uses a lot of the same ideas as the original set, but that's kind of the point. I don't really see why this remake was necessary if they weren't going to make wholesale changes and just keep the spirit of the original build. On top of this, I do feel there are other sets in this line that would have been more worthy, for want of a better word, of a remake before this. One in particular I think is crying out for a remake, and we'll get to that soon I'm sure. And I don't think that the interior is as good in this one as it was in the original, despite this one coming out some 6 years later. It's got a decent amount of minifigures. You've got some carol singers, obviously parents and children wanting to visit the toy shop, and the Christmas tree build is a very good one. It just doesn't really innovate much past the original build, and doesn't really feel particularly necessary based on what we've had before, with the only argument you could make being that obviously LEGO retires. That means that that first set isn't as readily available, but then you could say that about every single LEGO set ever. In 13th place we have 10275, which is the Elf Clubhouse. It's released in 2020, and there are a lot of elements to this build that I do really like. I like the Christmas lights that adorn the roof. They are quite large and not quite to scale with the rest of the building, but that's okay. I still think they work very well. I love some of the side builds. We get a moulded reindeer this time, as opposed to the brick built ones that were in Santa's workshop. The old PC is a fantastic little side build, really very clever design on that. And some of the toy builds that you get, such as the little ship, again, make very good use of very few pieces. You have the play feature of the bunk beds that tip the elves out to get them working for the day, I guess, and that works well enough, and I do like the overall look of the build. I will say that from this point down, or up, however you want to look at it, each of these is incredibly strong. There's nothing really wrong with any of them. I do think this is one of LEGO's most consistent sub-themes. It's just a case of feeling there are better builds ahead, and again, that more fantastical setting does keep it a bit lower on my list than you may find it on someone else's. In 12th place, you've got 10235, which is the Winter Village Market from 2013, and this was the set that I mentioned earlier that I feel could do with a remake. Again, that's not because I think it's a bad set, I don't at all. I think it's a lovely little set, one that's more than the sum of its parts. I just feel, for me, and again this is very personal, I just feel that when I go to a Christmas market, which is effectively what obviously this set is, I actually went to one today, funny enough. My wife and kids and I went to one today and it was lovely. This is not what I imagine when I go to one. I love the carousel, I think it's a very aesthetically pleasing build. Personally though, I wouldn't have had that in this set. I would have saved that for another year when you have a winter fun fair or something like that, and I would have extended the actual market side of it. I would have made the stalls a little bit bigger, made a few more of them. I would have had things like a hot chocolate stall, you know, someone selling cheese, someone that's created things out of wood, some sort of food stand. I know some of these are in there, don't get me wrong, but I would have really honed in on that side of it. And I do think that LEGO could do that and make something really quite lovely with this idea. Again, I do feel that maybe this is a cultural thing, because I said this about one of the Creator modular sets, one of the early ones, which was an indoor market. And whilst I like the idea of that set, it isn't what I imagine an indoor market to be. But that may just be that these are presented differently where you live in the world, you know. And here in the UK, this is just not what I imagine a Christmas market to be. So it does bring it down the list a bit for me. But when I look at each part individually, I do think it's lovely, and one that could have been a bit higher had it not been for that kind of personal reason. In 11th place, we have 10229 being the Winter Village Cottage from 2012. Now, I will say that I do think that of the first, what that'd be 9, 10, 11, 12, 4 sets that were released in this theme, this is the most impressive to look at up to that point. They were clearly improving their techniques every year, and this definitely does look much more impressive than the previous 3. It just again comes down to a bit of personal preference, where I do really like the street themed sets. You know, the larger cottage type sets are nice, and this one certainly does have a very pleasing vibe to it, but they're just not what I look for necessarily. You know, in some of the side builds with the snow plow and bits like that, nice little builds, but just not what I would be looking for in a winter village, where I'm really looking to create a whole street. And that winter market that I mentioned a moment ago, the way that I envisage it would fit perfectly into such a street. That being said, it does have some lovely details. I do like the blue that's used. I think that's a nice colour. I do love the tiled floor, something you don't always get with LEGO, and whenever they do it, I think it just increases the quality of a set. So other details, you know, kind of just the general homeliness of it, with the stockings over the fire, things like that. It's certainly a very charming set. And just again to reiterate that 11th place on this list is way up there in the top sort of 5 on other lists, because this theme is just so strong. Into the top 10 then, and we have 10325, Alpine Lodge from 2023. This one has some lovely details to it. The log cabin effect that they've created and how they've created it. Just the idea of having that Alpine Lodge, something very different from the sets that had come before it. And I suppose a logical next step in terms of ideas that they could have used. I like the little sled that's got the Christmas trees on the back that's being pulled along on a trailer. The outhouse is a nice clever idea, and you know, the other little side build just adds a bit more detail and depth to the set. I love the fireplace, or the chimney that extends up through the side of the build. The windows look lovely. It's got a nice classic feel to it in a lot of ways, going back to kind of classic LEGO, whilst infused with some new techniques such as the whole log cabin effect. It's just, again, it's of course a very different environment. We're talking about a ski lodge, or up in the mountains, and that's not what I go for personally. So there are other sets ahead of it in that respect. You don't see a whole lot of alpine lodges in North London where I grew up, so again, just in terms of my everyday life as a child and growing up obviously into a man, it's just not something I am really used to. But aside from all that, just looking at it objectively, it is a lovely build, and it's 10th on a very strong list. In 9th place we've got 10293, which is Santa's Visit 2021's offering. And this and the Alpine Lodge did shift places a couple of times as I was putting this list together. Ultimately it just came down to the style of building that this is compared to the lodge, and I just preferred this one a little more. I do love some of the details here, using the kind of Wolverine claws, if you like, as mistletoe. Very clever. Another use of that blue colour to create some sort of cottage, and I do feel that this one improves on the 2012 set. Again, it's got a very homely feel. I like the interior details, those stockings over the fire, very much like I said before, the tree itself, the presents under the tree, the way of separating the rooms with limited space. I think they've done a good job there. The family dining table and the family themselves, I just think it's a very homely and very charming set, much like the 2012 set in a lot of ways. I just feel that they've improved in the 9 years difference between those two sets. In 8th place we've got 10199, which is the original 2009's Winter Village toy shop. Now obviously the remake to this was back down in 14th place, and when you look at the two side to side, they do look very similar, and there are quite a few places difference between them. That's not because the 2015 one had anything wrong with it, it just was too faithful almost to this original, and it kind of made it feel a bit redundant. This was a lovely set for that first one in the wave. A lot of very classic ideas that go way back past this 2009 year, and really does evoke memories of classic and older Lego. That large brick built Christmas tree, which of course has become a bit of a staple of this series or this sub theme, but this was one of the first sets to do it, certainly the first in this theme. The build itself, the toy shop, really does have a charming look to it. Things that we see a lot these days, like the awning using those particular bricks, felt quite refreshing at the time. And of course we have similar characters to that remake that we've already spoken about in terms of carol sings and what have you. I like little things like the lamppost and the bench outside, just decent little side builds that add to the world and make it feel more than it otherwise would have. And the interior, whilst nothing spectacular, I do feel is actually better than its remakes. A nice set, and one that set the standard for what has now become a very popular sub-theme. In 7th place we've got 10263 Winter Village Fire Station 2018, being the year that it released. Now this and the one that you'll see in a moment are the other two on the list that kind of swap places a few times. For the most part actually my list is quite consistent, and I was quite sure on exactly where these sets will be placing, but yeah, this and another set did swap places a few times. I do love this build. I really do think this is a lovely looking set. I like the dark red and the tan. I think they work very well together. The fire station theme, or setting I should say rather, is a very good idea, and it's the only one of its kind in this theme so far. I do wonder if they'll move on to other such sets, whether you'll see a Winter Village style police station at some point. I love the fire engine with its extendable ladder, and again that ladder piece is just classic Lego. I remember having yellow ones of those as a kid, long before we got as many colours as we do these days. Similar to what I've said before, you have a bench and lamppost. I believe there's a frozen fountain, with people playing ice hockey or something like that on it as well. Yeah, fire hydrant, snowman, just all these little details that really do add to the world. And I do think they've made good use of the space inside to set up the feeling of a living, breathing fire station with people waiting for the call and waiting to spring into action. You've got the Dalmatian, something that most people would think of when you say fire station, certainly I'm sure in the USA, and something that was missing, sorely missing from the modular fire station that released a few years before this. When this is 7th place on any list, you've got a cracking list for sure. In at number 6 then we've got 10222, being Winter Village Post Office from 2011. Yeah, this and the fire station did swap places a few times. Ultimately what pushed this up just that bit higher was the fact that this really does look like a set in some ways that could have released in the early 90s. Not necessarily in terms of the actual build, but certainly that small post office van and the minifigures themselves, the uniform that the postal workers are wearing, just reminds me of kind of the 90s era of Lego. As someone that grew up with the late 80s, early 90s Lego, first and foremost, that's always going to be a win for me. The classic trees, not using the more brick built ones these times. Having the, what would you call it? Is that a gazebo, I suppose, with the band underneath it? Again, just a bit of world building, which I do think works so well with these sets. I think more so than most others. I'm not actually the biggest fan of side builds. I normally prefer Lego to concentrate on a main build. But with these Winter Village sets, I do think it just makes such a difference to have solid side builds with the main build. And this set certainly has that. I like the inside. Again, it's very basic, but I do think it serves the purpose well and looks like a small town post office. Tiled floor, always a good sign. And those Victorian bay windows are just a win. A lovely little set, this one, and a very early one, of course, in this line's lifespan. Just missed out on the top 5, but yeah, very, very solid. And pipping it into the 5th place was 10216, the Winter Village Bakery, which came out the year before in 2010. This kind of proves what I was just saying about the side builds, because if you look at the main building and the one that's just preceded it, this is probably not as impressive looking, and certainly not as impressive looking as some that have been lower down on the list. But I do feel that overall it presents a lovely package. You have another lake or kind of skating area. You have a horse and cart pulling along Christmas trees, and just a few other details that help bring this to life. I love the interior details for the bakery itself. I think it's very charming, very small, very quaint, but I just feel that that's what this Winter Village theme is all about, you know, that kind of simplicity of life and just how endearing that can be. I think that's what separates this theme from others that Lego provide. And again, I do feel that these figures just scream an earlier time in Lego. They definitely have that 90s feel to them, and the moulded horse is always a win as far as I'm concerned. Again, I grew up with those coming in your castle sets and what have you, so whenever I see one of those it does make me smile. But just a really lovely, charming set that's more than the sum of its parts. In 4th place we have 10259, which is the Winter Village Station, and this is the exception to the rule, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But first, let's look at the build itself. So obviously a train station. I do love Lego trains. I don't have any real love for trains in real life, but just in Lego form I always think they look great. I think this is an incredibly charming set. I think the exterior of the station itself looks lovely. I like the build, the technique of the build with that 45-degree angle for the front door. I think that's a nice touch. It didn't have to be built that way, and I think that adds some character. I like the newsstand, the little details that you'd expect to see, but I'm still happy that they're there. I like the level crossing. I think that was good that they included that and extended past just the train station itself. But then you have the bus. Now, I don't dislike the bus. I think it's a nice build, but where in every other set I've said the side builds help make it, I think here that particular side build detracts from this model, all the more so because I think the interior of this is like criminally sparse, and if they'd taken some of the pieces from that bus and improved the interior, I think this set would have been a couple of places higher. That being said, I do like the bus, it's absolutely fine, but its inclusion does hurt the set as far as I'm concerned, which is why it's only 4th, despite the fact this is one of my favourites out of all 16. In 3rd place then we've got 10267, this is the Gingerbread House from 2019, and this is another exception to the rule because I've already said that I prefer the more realistic buildings, and I've also said that I like the more street based ones. Now this is a house, not street based, and it's of course a home for gingerbread people, so yeah, completely fantasy based, but it's such a beautiful looking building that I couldn't in any good consciousness deny it a spot high on this list. I love the idea of a house made of sweets, a Lego house made of sweets. It goes back more to something like Hansel and Gretel, the story there, and the witch's cottage, but I just think it's such a whimsical idea, and it's pulled off perfectly here. The execution is spot on. The candy canes and the use of the red and the white, the gumdrops and all the other bits and bobs that make up the house itself. The use of the medium nougat, I believe it was, for the chimney that goes up through the middle, and that reddish brown to make the bulk of the house, the gingerbread, I just think looks wonderful. Topped off with some snow, which could quite easily be icing sugar, for example. And then of course the gingerbread characters are just very charming. There's some lovely little side builds in there, the little buggy for the baby, and the little train set. This is just a top set, and Good enough that even with my reservations about the fantasy sets, it stormed up the list into 3rd place. In 2nd place then we got 10308 being Holiday Main Street from 2022. Now I'm not sure what the general consensus is with this set, because I remember when it was released the reaction was quite mixed. I seem to remember some people were very lukewarm on it, feeling it looked incomplete, and the 2 builds you get being the 2 shops, I seem to remember people saying were very basic and very small and only 4 studs deep and what have you, and that even with the inclusion of a tram it still felt quite minimalistic. I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I still feel that it's more than the sum of its parts, which is a saying I've said a few times about a few of these sets, and I think it applies perfectly to a lot of the Winter Village sets in general. But it's just a perfect representation of what I love about Winter Villages, being a small village or town, not your hustle of bustle of a big city like I grew up in London, with these quaint little shops like music shops and toy shops, with a small community gathered around, and something like the tram just encapsulates this perfectly. I think this is a beautiful little set. I think it's one that will become much more appreciated over time if it isn't already. Maybe I read the room completely wrong and actually everyone loves it, I don't know. But if that isn't the case, I do think this one will get its appreciation in a few years' time for sure. It's one of my favourites, so up there in number 2, and it does retire at the end of this year, so if you are interested in it, you may want to jump on it soon. Chances are it will sell out soon on lego.com or in LEGO stores if it hasn't already, so you might want to spring into action really if it's one you're interested in. And the final set then, 1st place by process of elimination, is 10254, the Winter Holiday Train from 2016. This was the first of the Winter Village sets that I ever bought. I'd seen a few of them, don't get me wrong, and I'd liked what I'd seen. Never really felt that I needed to get them. And then this train came out and I was compelled to pick it up immediately, and then started to look back at some of the ones I'd missed that were still quite easily obtainable at that point because this set drew me in so much. Then of course they released the station the next year, and that just cemented my love of these sets. And like I said, as much as that is at number 4, it should have been 2nd place really. It's just that interior that let that set down. This set, whilst it's not particularly realistic in terms of the type of train it is, I do feel that works well in this Winter Village theme, even if you're not looking at the fantastical side of it, because you get these sort of trains at Christmas fairs and things like that. You take your kids on them for a ride. So they're trains that you definitely see this time of year, and that we as a family have used. You get 4 sections of the train, being the engine, the coal tender, the flatbed and the caboose, and a number of other little bits and bobs. Obviously the track for the train to go on, a small bench and some other bits, some toys and what have you. And again, I just think that fits nicely with the theme of having this somewhere that you would go to visit for Christmas. The size is a bit small, but again, I don't think that's an issue when you factor in what I just said about how I interpret the train. And it was just lovely to see them go in this direction after a few years of, houses and buildings of any sort of type. The train was always going to be number 1 for me, despite the fact that it's got some very heavy competition, but what a fantastic theme overall. And yeah, this for me is number 1. So there you have it, that's my ranking of all 16 of the Winter Village sets from 2009 up until 2024. Do you agree with my ranking? Where would you place certain sets? Please do feel free to put your ranking in the comment section below. I'd be intrigued to see how sets such as the Holiday Main Street hold up, or what people's opinions is of it. Bearing in mind what I said, that when it came out I did see a lot of negativity towards it. I think it's great, so yeah, I'd be interested to see what you think. Let me know in the comment section below. Do feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I do have other playlists and what have you if you want to watch a bit more of my content, and give the video a like if you liked it. And until next time, take care and happy building.